But I found out all kinds of exciting stuff about heaven. And what got me started is this New York Times best-selling book called Heaven is for Real. How many people have read that book, Heaven is for Real? Just a few of you. I was going to buy a case of them and have them out for sale, and we're just really not set up for that. But you can go on Amazon.com. They're about 11 bucks. Or Christian Book Distributors, CBD.com. They're about 8 bucks. But I will tell you, I sat down and I read this book from cover to cover in about 4 hours without moving. I mean, I just went to get, refill my drink or something. So it is really a fascinating book about this little boy who, when he was not quite 4 years old, went to heaven. One national survey suggests that 81% of all Americans believe in an afterlife of some sort, and 76% of those call that afterlife heaven. So, isn't it interesting that we sort of are living in this postmodern, post-Christian time, and yet 75% of people believe that there's going to be an afterlife. They believe that this isn't all that there is. And Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11 says, "Yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time, and he has planted eternity in the human heart." Okay, so here's the thing, is the writer of Ecclesiastes tells us that God has planted eternity in the human heart. People want to believe that there's an eternal life. So here's the book. Todd wrote this, Todd Burpo wrote this. Over 3 million copies have been sold. It's a New York Times bestseller. Todd, in fact, my sister-in-law is the one who told me about it, because as most of you know, my mother-in-law recently passed away, and I was actually reading my mother-in-law a book about a man who died and gone to heaven. And then my sister-in-law got this book, and she recommended that I read it. And so I bought it, and then, the rest is history. But anyway, Todd Burpo, who wrote the book, is a pastor of a Crossroads Wesleyan Church in Imperial, Nebraska. And he is the father of Colton Burpo, who underwent an emergency appendectomy when he was not yet 4 years old. After a miraculous recovery, Colton began to describe to his parents his visit to heaven during his ordeal. And while Todd and his wife Sonia were skeptical at first, Colton authenticated his claim by describing exactly what his parents were doing in another part of the hospital during his operation. How many people here have had a kind of out-of-body experience when you were like near death? Yeah. How many? Raise your hand high so we can see. 4 of you. Yeah, it's not that uncommon. I'm telling you that I'm a person who's always been very interested in these near-death experiences. And when Wendy and I were first dating, we went and saw Dr. Eby. How many have heard of Dr. Eby? Just a few of you. Okay. So I think Wendy and I, this was about 1982. I had come to visit her parents and her in Lodi, I think at Christmas, maybe in 81, 82, something like that. And we heard that at one of the local churches, like the Church of Christ, Dr. Eby was speaking. Now, Dr. Eby is an MD, and he was sitting on the 10th floor balcony of a building in Chicago, and he lost his balance, fell over, and went headfirst into the concrete and died. They took him to the morgue. They drained out all his blood, filled him with embalming fluid, and put him in a drawer in the morgue. Well, meanwhile, he went to heaven and he went to hell. He went to hell first, and then he went to heaven. And he's an interesting guy to listen to him speak, because he comes up and he carries his birth certificate in a his death certificate in a frame, and he sets the frame up on the pulpit. And so he's a medical doctor, and he has a death certificate for himself. But here's just a couple clips from it. This is actually from an interview by Pat Robertson. And he says, "To those people who think that death is painful, let me disabuse your mind." You can tell he's a MD to use disabuse. I'm not even sure if that's a correct use of that word. But anyways, disabuse your mind. It is the release from pain. The moment that you are dead, and let's hope you're going to heaven, the minute that a Christian is dead, he has the greatest bliss, which can merely be imagined down here. And instantly, with no time lapse at all, I find myself out of the mud body and in the spirit body in paradise. It is so powerful, there's no way to define it in English. Instantly, I'm in heaven. Instantly, I'm landing on something just as solid as this floor. And this little part here, this is the part I've remembered all these years, and I've heard other people who went to heaven had similar experiences, so you might remember this one. So I look at my legs, and inside my legs are flowers on which I'm standing. And of course, instantly I think, oh, I'm going to bruise one of God's flowers. So I decide to pull my leg up off the flowers, and I look down and my leg is off of them just by deciding to do it. And there they are, untouched, unblemished, unbruised. So I put my leg back down, and sure enough, they went back up my leg. Amen. So it's really an amazing testimony, and I'll try to remember to put a link to it on my email that I sent out tonight. And then here's another one. I really like this one. And again, I just was rereading a little bit of his stuff last night. The music of heaven, of course, is fantastic. And I knew right away that it was different from anything on earth. The music was flowing like a river from everywhere. Isn't that cool? The music was flowing like a river. Okay, hold on just a second. How are we doing? Do we have that little video? Why don't you just play a couple minutes of it? I'm sorry. For some reason, the lights are shining off. Oh, yeah, we got time. Let's go ahead and play just a few minutes. This is Colton Burpo being interviewed on television. We'll just watch a couple minutes.
Is very real. Colton Burpo was just 3 years old when he got a sneak peek at what is to come. Take a look.
How old are you today?
3.
And what is your name? And where do you live?
Nebraska.
Who's your mommy?
Sonia.
Who's your daddy?
Daddy. Popo.
Who's your sister?
Cassie.
That was 8 years ago. Looking at Colton now, you would have never guessed that he almost died in 2003. His father, Todd, tells about Colton's near-death experience in the book, Heaven is for Real.
And he started throwing up into the toilet, you know, and at first we're like, okay, he's got the stomach flu, because the doctor said it was going around.
Colton's condition only got worse as days passed. His doctor discovered his appendix had burst. An infection was spreading in his body. Time was running out.
And we knew we were in bad shape when they said, well, you need to come out to the hallway. They separated us from everyone else, and then someone came to us and started talking to us that we got to have surgery on your kid.
It was tough. Seeing your boy be lifeless when he was a very vibrant child.
And it was at that moment that we were looking at each other. I remember my wife holding Colton in that hallway, just us. He's not even moving. We went to the surgery prep area, and I remember them hauling him away and him just yelling at me, Daddy, don't let him take me. Daddy, don't let him take me. And I went back to the pre-op room where we had left some stuff. And I was finally alone, shut the door. And I just broke down, and I was mad at God. I just was frustrated, fed up. And I remember telling him, I said, God, after all I've done for you, and now you're going to take my kid? This is how you treat your pastors?
And I was calling our prayer chain. I was calling anybody that would be on the other line to get Colton on the prayer chain because it was bad.
We were there in the waiting room for an hour and a half, maybe. Then I remember the nurse coming out. Is Colton's daddy out here? I'm like, yeah, well, Colton's in recovery, and he's screaming for you. And I'm sitting there with him. And I remember my son in that room then looking up at me and goes, Dad, do you know I almost died? And my first thought was, maybe you overheard the nurse say that, or maybe they thought he was under anesthesia, you know, and he wasn't. But it wasn't till 4 months after we got out of the hospital that we finally listened to our son.
And that's where I got to see heaven. No, Jesus and some angels came and flew me up to heaven.
And I said, so Colton, what did Jesus look like?
I knew that the first person I saw was Jesus. He was wearing white robes with a purple sash, and he just came down nicely and gracefully.
Well, Dad, Jesus has markers. Dad, Jesus has markers. I didn't know what he meant, so I finally asked the right question. Colton, where are Jesus' markers? And he drops his toys down, he stands up, and he just points, Dad, they were right here. He takes his fingers, points to the palms, then he bends over and touches the tops of his feet. He looks up to me, that's where Jesus' markers were, Dad.
When I was in the throne room of God to start with, so I got to see what that looked like. I was upset because I didn't know what was happening. What God did is he used people or things that I liked to calm me down. From there on, I felt better.
And one day we're traveling together, and he looks up at me and, Dad, you used to have a grandpa named Pop, didn't you? I'm like, yeah, he's really nice. Really? Yeah, you used to play with him as a kid and work with him on the farm and shoot stuff with him. And I'm like, yeah, how do you know that? Well, he told me.
A figure came up, and he was Pop. He asked me, are you Todd's son? I said yes. He said that he was his grandpa, so that's where I met him.
Yeah, Pop, I was very close to him. And he was my most significant male role model when I was a kid, growing up. But he was killed in a car wreck before I turned 7.
I was busy paying bills again, because that's my job. And he came up and told me he had 2 sisters. Well, he had to say it several times before he finally got my attention. And finally, I put myself down and looked at him and says, what do you mean you have 2 sisters? No, I have 2 sisters. You had a baby, died in your tummy. And I just looked at him like, well, how do you know you have 2 sisters? Well, she told me. And then he proceeded to describe her.
She looked like Cassie, but she had brown hair. And first time when she saw me, she just came up and hugged me.
I knew this is true because he said, she kept hugging me. She wouldn't stop hugging me, Mom, and I didn't like that.
Well, I'm not really the hugging type.
I miscarried the weekend of Father's Day weekend, which made it even rougher. And we thought we'd dealt with it. We gotten over, we accepted that the baby had died. But when he said he had 2 sisters, I think I was in shock first and then trying to realize, what is he telling me? And so I knew that he had seen her, and after he described her, he said, she's just waiting for you guys to come to heaven.
You know, as we talked about heaven, and he was telling me all these wonderful details, I just felt like I had to ask him, did he want to come back?
I knew that I was leaving heaven because Jesus came to me and said, Colton, you need to go back. Even though I didn't want to go back, he said that he was answering my dad's prayer.
I remember that prayer. That irreverent, that disrespectful, screaming at God prayer. I was like, he's answering that prayer?
Today, Colton is a healthy 11-year-old and shares his heavenly journey with boldness.
I learned that heaven is for real, and you're going to like it.
I learned that heaven is real and you're going to like it. Why are you going to like it? Because you're going to be with a loving God.
Okay,
We sometimes
that's just perfect.
miss.
Stop it right there. Thank you. All right. Did you like that?